Let's begin today with the liberal economist John Maynard Keynes. He's an economist most known for his work in the post-war period. This same work that acted as something of a template for a lot of the changes that were occurring in capitalism throughout the 20th century. Keynes in general was sort of optimistic about government's ability to rein in the worst of the free market through financial stimulus and smart regulation, and more judicious understanding of macroeconomic predictions, market volatility, and the excising of corrupt figures who manipulate and take advantage of institutions unto their own end. For Keynes, the potential for a future of absolute prosperity it can be found by revising the economic canon to account for the times in which the free market, in all of its wisdom, needs correction via monetary injection and regulation. I think most remarkable was how he came up with a lot of his ideas for financial stimulus to combat economic recession during the landmark depressions of the early 20th century. A time with huge unemployment and inequality, 2 world wars, a lot of uncertainty about the future, including the future of capitalism, considering all of those pesky European revolutions and that Soviet nonsense. Now, Keynes was not stopped by the potential for a darker future, and between 1928 and 1930, he gave a series of lectures that would become an essay titled Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. It was about how, despite the challenges facing the world during the Great Depression, the developing conditions of capitalism paint a more optimistic future than first glance offers. The Great Depression is a great growing pain in the larger changes in capitalist production, whose functions and problems were exacerbated and accelerated by the First World War, and what was missing was regulation. There's a car that was without power steering or very good brakes.
The pace at which we can reach our destination of economic bliss will be governed by 4 things: our power to control population, our determination to avoid wars and civil dissensions, our willingness to entrust to science the direction of those matters which are properly the concern of science, and the rate of accumulation as fixed by the margin between our production and our consumption, of which the last will easily look after itself, given the first 3.
So the problem with what Keynes proposes is, at least in part, a problem of his Whiggish history. The pursuits of man were leading us on the inevitable march toward progress. Now that we've institutionalized these liberal Enlightenment values and ideals alongside managed capitalist economies. Constitutionalism, modern rationality, all of this would bringing us toward unleashing our full potential so long as the rate of accumulation is given a chance to look after itself. So to be in this weird sort of cyber dystopian late capitalist Q-pilled modern world, all of this seems pretty fucking funny. But there's something remarkable about contrasting our current period with what Keynes saw as the inevitable cost of progress, this inevitable problem of boredom. It was this idea that eventually the working week was going to grow so short, really, that if we even had to work at all, lol, it would just be to socialize with one another. The problems of our current day and days past will seem like just a big joke, apparently, in comparison.
I look forward, therefore, in days not so very remote, to the greatest change which has ever occurred in the material environment of life for human beings in the aggregate. But of course it will all happen gradually, not as a catastrophe. Indeed, it has already begun. The course of affairs will simply be that there will be ever larger and larger classes and groups of people for whom problems of economic necessity have been practically removed. The critical difference will be realized when this condition has become so general that the nature of one's duty to one's neighbor is changed.
Keynes has made a very large presumption here regarding the functions of capitalism, I would say. And something that he probably couldn't have seen coming in the first half of the 20th century. Because of deindustrialization and improvements to technology and reduction to the working day, Well, they have not appeased capitalism's sort of obsessive intervention in our daily lives. The problem with capitalism is its regenerative and reconstructive properties, not just in its ability to adapt to new processes of creating, buying, and selling new modes of production, but also in its ability to occupy an enlarged space in the day-to-day lives of working people. Rather than what Keynes predicted, that shortening the working day and raising the standard of living, deindustrialization, automated manufacturing, and technological progress will lead to a new utopian world where we just simply have too much leisure time. I mean, instead, what happened to capitalism, it just simply reconstructed the restrictions and coercive means used to sustain itself. So, I mean, even when we don't take into account Keynes' very European perspective when it comes to the march toward progress in the 20th century, I mean, we can still see a primary contradiction in this particular form of liberal economic theory, because boredom is not a reflection in the raising of our standard of living, but it's this huge part of the way that capitalism inserts itself into our leisure time. Leisurely boredom, the doom scroll, in our contemporary moment is basically currency. The new model for monetization is the attention economy, the same one that keeps us on Twitter and going down YouTube rabbit holes. Please finish my video. And to give Keynes maybe a little bit of credit, the changes in how we live our lives that came with deindustrialization were probably hard to predict in some ways. It would maybe be unfair to hold Keynes accountable for the techno-gig economy and failing to predict the internet if his capitalist rose-colored glasses weren't very helpful in describing how we got here in the first place.
Warning. Temperature rising. Life support falling. Seek shelter. Build anew. Find the exterior.
The beginning of No Man's Sky it's kind of perfect. Because even as the game is loading, I didn't really think about this the first time that I saw it, but you appear to be kind of flying in space towards some unknown destination. And when you arrive, the first thing that happens is you hear a voice.
Commencing Atlas system suit initialization. Life support systems activated.
As the player slowly regains their vision, your suit begins to communicate the severity of your situation.
Scanner damaged. Repair required. Aerial propulsion jetpack online.
A crashed ship comes into view, and next to it, this strange orb. This object is part of what is called the Atlas. In No Man's Sky, there are these entities. They're depicted as these black orbs inside of larger objects, often like large diamonds. They were once worshipped as gods by some of the races in No Man's Sky, and they are scattered around this universe as this very strange series of interconnected, interactive objects. The various updates to No Man's Sky since its release have added considerably to its story, but when you play it on day one, when I played it on day one, what I saw were these sort of strange obelisks, both on planets and in space. They passed on these cryptic, strange messages, sometimes in languages I couldn't understand. This game, it's set in a multi-quintillion planet universe, and it's open to all who have the time and basic resource gathering skills. This game of infinite things to see, to catalog, species to meet, with languages to learn. This game that, yes, will try and use the dangers of space to do you harm and challenge you, while still, at its core, retaining the discourse of surplus, of excess. The game that presents itself as one with nearly limitless possibilities is also a profoundly solitary and lonely experience. And it's in this aspect of No Man's Sky that speaks directly to our current moment.
I desire a new urgency, a place among the crawling assemblage, above the roaring sea, 360 degrees.
The consequence is a strange kind of existential state in which exhaustion bleeds into insomniac overstimulation. No matter how tired we are, there's still time for one more click, and enjoyment and anxiety coexist. The fact that the smartphone makes cyberspace available practically anywhere at any time means that boredom, or at least the old-style Fordist boredom, has effectively been eliminated from social life. Ultimately, communicative capitalism does not vanquish boredom so much as it sublates it, seeming to destroy it only to preserve it in a new synthesis. The characteristic affective tonality for the insomniac drift of cyberspace, in which there is always one more click to make, one more update to check, combines fascination with boredom. We are bored even as we are fascinated, and the limitless distraction allows us to evade confronting death, even as death is closing in on us.
As economic changes throughout the rest of the 20th century gave way to a productive mode that emphasized the rapid creation of cheap consumer goods and a growing media apparatus to accompany them, the changes in our workplaces and the social spaces where we spend all the rest of our time were profound and far-reaching. New forms of social organization popped up in this period. This period of deindustrialization led to the formations of social interactions as we know them today. This kind of surplus form of living that acts as a very thin mask for oddly restrictive and over-organized forms of leisure. So when I was growing up in a shitty Florida city, mostly known as the sort of starter's pistol for the opioid crisis here, the only thing to do really, besides the beach, which was so often just completely filled with tourists, was to just go to a mall or go to a Walmart and just wander around and glance at these objects that are often telling you to buy more objects. All of this stuff that's imbued with all this character and meaning through, mascots and celebrity sponsorships and, the gestures of the things we saw on TV. It works similarly to the online consumptive space, which is largely about occupying our attention and, placing a hand on our shoulders to sort of point our gaze toward the center of the mode of production. Good workers and consumers drive toward the destination despite the sort of nauseating, overstuffed feeling that journey gives you. And as you're sort of following the sparkle of adventure along the path of consumption, you gather objects to construct other objects to fly toward more objects. The closer to the center of this way of living that you get, the closer you get to seeing it for what it actually is. In the case of No Man's Sky, it's a computer, and that computer's simulation and this separate artificial intelligence now embedded in your suit. You, the traveler, are a scan of this AI's mind and an extension of the well-kept secret of this world. That as you set out across worlds, leaping across systems and towards the center of a universe, on the way meeting strangers and finding foreign ships and technology and creating new stars, it's really hard to tell what's real. And thus, it's really hard to tell what matters. Not only is No Man's Sky profoundly lonely, but it suffers from the same oppressive, systematized discourses of our contemporary moment, a mundane collecting of useless objects with which we can piece together our subjectivity, our values, some fragment of a way of living. No Man's Sky is the intersection of digital and material accumulation and their uses in the production of improved technologies. Then for the gathering of more digital and physical materials. The cryptic messages, your journey toward the center of the universe, only to be sent back toward the outside. This fixed circle of progress constructs a great illusion of accomplishment, of contribution to some great historical narrative, process of scientific discovery or economic innovation, but what just turns out to be an exercise in meaningless accumulation for some great larger entity, the thing actually running the show, despite all the various ways it makes us feel like we have agency and freedom when we really don't. No Man's Sky is about a sort of post-consumption amnesia that just points us down the same path with the slightest of variations over and over. It's almost like its world is screaming at you, discover this, find this, this is exciting and new, all while something eats at you, something that just says, I feel like maybe I've been here before. Maybe in some form, at some time, as someone. This is really the emotional center of No Man's Sky, is to have so much extraordinary stuff in front of you. I mean, there's so many great things and people to see and meet, but to feel so profoundly lost and lonely, left empty by the so-called purpose of this journey, and motivated only by the discovery of what's caused this to begin with. It is a central function of this world, and I would argue ours as well, right now at least. I'm quite often very frustrated by the sense of oppressive boredom and malaise and repetition, the incredibly heavy weight of this sort of post-industrial process of immaterial, impulsive, libidinal accumulation that has become the very center of our lives. All my time should be spent collecting not just enough physical objects to fit in my prohibitively costly apartment, but also, likes, tweets, and retweets, and follows, and reblogs, and Steam achievements, and Steam XP to get Steam badges and decorations for my Steam profile. This is the colonization of everyday life in the post-industrial, post-consumer economy, and it means that instead of walking around malls, we wander around the internet, taking in information, anxiously making sure we're not being left out of some important discovery hereto unappreciated in other historical periods without this kind of intimate interconnectivity. The profound loneliness of No Man's Sky is also an interesting kind of possibility, because in your journey from strange structure to structure, all these monoliths that sit shrouded in ambiguity, what they also do is they resonate the possibility of something that seems just outside of your reach, but that is emerging in your imagination. Some way to reconstruct this inevitability in our existence into a machine that can take us toward the future, a future outside of the very repetitious navel-gazing and historical reconstructions of our current moment, a vehicle to drive us toward whatever could be after this, something other than this.
I desire a new urgency, a place among the crawling assemblage, above the roaring sea, 360 degrees, wriggling, turning, changing, a political menace, a horizon, a new possibility.